start the show proper. So see y'all in a second. Okay, hello everybody. Sorry about the delay. We were assuming that you had been grabbed by feds or something, my friend. We're like,
No.
he was supposed to be here at 9, and he's just AWOL. Like, has he been grabbed by the upside down authorities for being wrong think? But hello everybody. A lot of you already know who this is. For the people that don't know, if you could introduce yourself.
So I'm LibertyDownUnder. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, and I'm a young ANCAP from Australia.
Yeah, and you're the perfect person to talk to. You've been making the rounds on all of my friends' shows because your government kind of seems to be going like full V for Vendetta in real time, and it's really disturbing, and it's happening really fast to people in the West. But I've listened to you talk, and this is actually something that's kind of been creeping up and amplifying over time, and this isn't something that just like instantly happened. So if you kind of want to talk about at least your current situation and like the immediate like reality on the ground of what's going on.
So I live in regional Queensland. So the states that are facing the lockdown right now are New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT, which is our version of Washington DC. So right now, like they've just announced new freedoms for the vaccinated people that will come into effect later this month. In New South Wales, you can, if you're within one of the local government areas of concern in Sydney and in the greater Sydney area, you can, from 30th of September, if you're vaccinated, you can leave your home for an extra hour a day. So currently you're allowed 1 hour of exercise, and that's it. And they're going to say if you're vaccinated, you can get an extra hour outside every day. So that's the state we're at. Like, people are being arrested for protesting, organizing protests. A guy called Anthony Kaloof, who was big on Instagram, got arrested. He's in prison for 8 months, last I heard, for organizing a protest in Sydney. So that's the point we're at now. Victoria has just said that what they're going to do is, if you want to go to a park, once they open the parks, you've got to scan a QR code to check in there. So what the government's been doing all across Australia is a QR code system, so that way they can do contact tracing for you. So it's at the point now, if you want to visit a park outside, you've got to have one parent for all the kids who are going from your family, and I've got to use the QR code to sign in so the government can track you.
So is it like an app that you check in, or is there literally like a barcode scanner at the gate to the park, or do you have cops and health workers like wandering around the park and like checking people's codes? Like, how are they going about it?
No, so we have everyone has to download onto their phone a QR reader that's approved by the government, and then you scan the QR code through that.
Jeez. Okay. Yeah. Has there been any instances of this, and what do they do if they catch somebody in a park that didn't check in, essentially didn't scan?
I have no idea, because I don't know how they're going to enforce that yet, unfortunately. But I do know that the government is not happy if you don't sign in. That's so where I am, Toowoomba is a Liberal Party stronghold in a Labor state. We haven't had COVID here since June last year. So not many people are using the QR codes to sign in compared to in other places like Brisbane on the coast, the capital city, where they've had COVID. So the government is quite upset that people here aren't using it. Of course, they can't track everyone and punch people for not signing in. But I presume if the police are there and they see someone not signing in, they can, find them or whatever. But I haven't seen that in person, so I wouldn't know.
Okay. The other thing I was really interested in before we kind of go into the general topics, have you personally experienced any of the videos that have been going around of the helicopters flying around neighborhoods, like blasting sirens and stuff like that, telling people not to go outside or telling people that their curfew is up, and all the other videos we've kind of seen in? Is that going on in I don't know if you guys call it prefectures or provinces or states, but your region in Australia?
No, so that's only in Melbourne and in Sydney.
Okay. Yeah, so that when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, that's the worst I've actually seen it, more than anything. In terms of because obviously, a lot of people have talked to about the general restrictions and stuff like that. I kind of want to focus on things people don't think of that have become more difficult because of all of this. I talked to someone who's a Kiwi actually over in New Zealand, and she was talking about how pharmacies, she called them chemists, which was really fun, how they're really difficult to get into right now where she lives in New Zealand. And I was wondering if there's anything you could think of kind of normal, mundane things, whether it's utilities, groceries, the internet, or whatever, that have become a big pain in the ass lately underneath all of this that other people might not consider. Because the obvious infringements are obviously obvious, but there's all sorts of kind of secondary life affecting things stuff like this bring about.
So yeah, I think the big one, I obviously I don't know what it's like in New Zealand, but to get anything from the shops in New South Wales and Victoria, especially in Sydney and Melbourne, is a real pain in the neck. Like, they've got thousands of Woolworths, which is grocery store chain here. Thousands of Woolworth staff are in lockdown, so obviously they can't staff the stores because these are staff that have been said that they've been in the same area as someone who's been infected. So they've got a lockdown for 14 days. So of course, all these shops, like, even if they can open, most of their staff are in quarantine, so they're understaffed. So of course, customers then can't buy what they need to buy because there's not enough staff there to serve them, that sort of stuff.
Right. And is there the widespread destruction of business over there, like it's going on in the United States? Because in Detroit, in Michigan, I think the statistic was 63% of minority-owned businesses closed down permanently and are not coming back. Is that going on in Australia, or is there a more widespread kind of social welfare system keeping people up, or is it kind of like we are over here, where we're facing kind of everyone just being screwed and everyone losing their businesses and their houses and everything because they can't work?
So the government is doing a welfare program for those who can't work, but a lot of businesses are closing because they are either ineligible or they just can't support themselves because they've got no customers. So although the staff are fine because they're getting relief if they're eligible for it, the actual business itself is often struggling in many places.
Yeah, so
a lot of them have closed down.
Yeah, that sounds exactly like what's going on over here. And are you personally seeing more resistance kind of building to this? Or are you seeing kind of more compliance and bootlicking kind of coming out of all this? Because Australia Twitter makes it look like every single person in the country is wants to be locked in their house forever, and anyone who steps outside gets shot or attacked by dogs or something. So what's your personal kind of experience, the reality of if there is an opposition movement kind of growing to this and more non-compliance, or are people kind of feeling defeated and staying home, especially after the arrest of those activists and organizers?
So I would say that there's slowly been a movement of people, who are willing to, disagree with the protests, or disagree with the lockdown, and support the protesters, but not that many people are willing to actually go out and do it themselves. So most people, are silent supporters, and but they'll comply with the lockdowns and the COVID jabs and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, seems to be the same over here as it is over there. It's just they're getting away with more kind of over there at the moment. And I know in terms of enforcement, this is something I do like to ask of people in other countries. I know in Italy they had like routine patrols, same thing in Canada, where they had the police literally like wandering the neighborhoods looking for quarantine breakers and stuff like that. Are they doing that in Australia? Is there like active like patrols looking for people, or is it more on call? I know there was that big news story where there was essentially a manhunt for a guy that wandered out of his apartment. I think that was in Bristol. I could be mistaken though. Is that kind of going on, or yeah?
So it's in Sydney and Melbourne. There are police doing the rounds. There was a story a few weeks back about a guy who left his house in his car to get some fresh air, and the police were doing the rounds, and they knocked on his house, and he wasn't there. And he came back, and they were still waiting for him, and then they gave him a fine when he got back. So yeah, police are definitely doing the rounds. Making sure that people are in quarantine and locked down in their homes.
So they're actually doing like they're actually doing
door
like
knocking. Yes,
door knock. Wow, that's fucking dark. Um, yeah, I'm gonna try not to laugh too hard at this out of just like a response to how horrifying it is, but definitely, I remember looking back and a story people kind of forgot. I actually want to get your take on this too. Was I'm gonna butcher the names and location because I can't even keep up with the United States ones. I always mix them up. But the high rise, I think it was like an assisted living apartments, whatever, that they locked people in Australia. If you remember what I'm talking about, they had
yes.
yeah. Did anything ever come of that? Was anyone held accountable for the people that were like not able to get their medications or anything? Is those towers still in like a similar state, or whatever happened with that? Because that was a news story that kind of just came and went, despite how horrifying it was that they had the military and the police essentially surrounding a building and refusing to let anyone leave.
So that's called a hotel quarantine, is the name we give it. So that's happening in most places. In Queensland, for example, where I live, it's the only way you can isolate really to come across the border. In New South Wales and in Victoria, they're more willing to let people, quarantine at home if need be. But in Queensland, unless you've got like reasonable grounds to go at home, if you've got a family to look after, or you got a dependent, like your mother is dependent on you and she's like elderly and that sort of stuff, you have to quarantine in hotels, in unit complexes and apartments, that sort of stuff, in high rises for that, which would normally be used for people who are on holidays. And of course now, because that's what's happening in Queensland, they've now had to close the border completely because they've just filled up those quarantine facilities because people.
So you're talking about interstate borders too, not like,
yes,
like international borders. So there's
interstate borders.
Wow. Okay.
So the Queensland Premier closed the interstate borders just for 14 days because it's a 14-day quarantine, just to flush those the hotel quarantine system out. But of course, it was revealed like 2-3 days ago that she's let in the wives, girlfriends, and children of over 100 football players to Queensland.
Of course, because classism, that's always going to apply in this. If you're accepted, then we'll do whatever you want for it. Obviously, it's going on here with people having parties and stuff if they're wealthy and in the connection, but the average pleb is not allowed to do anything.
Yep.
Definitely another thing I kind of want to touch on is obviously even in Australia, Northern Territory and Southern Australia are kind of like overlooked because that's bush, that's middle of nowhere. How are that, obviously like rural America and the flyover states here pretty much just ignored COVID lockdowns and quarantines and everything and just kind of continued on business as usual. Is that going on as well in kind of like more central Australia and stuff like that? Is there any news coming out of there? Like what's going on, in the rest of the country outside of obviously the capitals and the coastal kind of areas?
So in the Northern Territory, they tend to lock down borders hard and fast because that's where most of the Aboriginal population lives in Australia. So they try to protect the Aboriginal people by locking down hard and fast because, of course, they don't have the same immune system as white people do. Or at least that's one reason I've heard for it. But yeah, they tend to lock down really hard and fast. In South Australia, they a couple of weeks ago said that if you're at home quarantining, you've got to put a sign up that says you're in quarantine inside your house. I know someone I saw on Twitter compared it to painting your house with lamb's blood in the Passover in the Bible. And then in Western Australia, they began lockdown really hard, really fast, and try and get over COVID as quick as they can. So right now, they've had 9 deaths in Western Australia since COVID started. They've had 20,000 deaths from other causes.
Yeah,
so non-COVID and 20,000 from other causes, and they still lock down hard and fast.
Yeah. So yeah, not even the rural areas are being spared of it. So that's something else that kind of separates Australia from everybody else. Is even I think even in like northern Italy and stuff like that, the more rural communities, when they had like the military running around locking things down in the beginning of COVID, the rural communities were kind of spared from that. But it sounds like even in Australia, if you're in the middle of nowhere, the government there is taking it very seriously and enforcing this. And I mean, I couldn't imagine it's very easy to enforce way out in the middle of the bush, but I don't know. Am I kind of misrepresenting like what's going on there? Are they actually kind of hitting these very like remote kind of like farmers and stuff like that with the same amount of protection?
I have heard a story that came out recently of Sydney police traveling 500 miles to find someone. I don't know if it's true. That only came out yesterday, I'm pretty sure, and I haven't had time to verify that yet. So I'm not saying whether it's true or false, but that is an interesting story that's happened. In Western Australia, almost all the population lives in the southwest corner, so that's locked down. The rest of the state isn't, so because they can't enforce it in the entire state. But in New South Wales and in Victoria, the rural areas are locked down.
Yeah, because
it depends on a state-to-state basis.
I was saying, I don't know if it was Australia or New Zealand, but they had that whole thing where they were flying helicopters around looking for campers and stuff, and like telling them to go home or finding them or ticketing them. I wasn't sure if that was New Zealand or Australia though.
Yes, so we do have those flying around in the cities, and saying to people to leave. Like there was one story that I shared of a helicopter at a park, telling people at the park to leave the park because the police are coming, and then the police turned up. I don't know if New Zealand's doing something similar, though. I haven't heard anything from them.
Right. Yeah, it seems kind of wild what's going on there. And then I guess to touch on the most recent update, I'm not super familiar with it, but I have kind of a passing knowledge of the cyber security or cyber initiative or whatever that they just put in to that essentially allows the government to access your phone. If you could kind of go into the implications and how deep that is and kind of what you understand of it, because there's a lot of sensationalism out of the West in one direction or another, saying it's not a big deal, or then people thinking that like they're going to blow people's phones up in their pockets, and every opinion in between. So if you can kind of give like the on the ground perspective of kind of the sentiment around that and what you think that means, and kind of how that bill is actually going to work.
So I presume that you're referring to the surveillance legislation amendment, Identify and Disrupt bill?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that will allow the police with a warrant to access your phone and your computer and delete data and take stuff down and copy stuff, whatever they need to do with regard to that. So they basically have limited access to your phone. And or in your computer, and if you refuse to comply, they can send you to prison. They do need a warrant from the court, but as we've seen with the FISA courts in America, under the Patriot Act, those warrants tend to be given all the time without any questions asked.
Yeah, and I mean this is really important too, because one thing I do know about it is a lot of it is based off of a lot of the same software and ideology behind a similar program they used in South Korea before COVID. And there was a giant controversy over there because it was a whistleblower exposed that the government and the police were using it to download child pornography on political opponents' phones and then arrest them for it. And they blew the whistle on this, and there was borderline riots in the street, and the South Korean president had to come out and like apologize for it. But 2 weeks later, COVID happened. So that story kind of got swept under the rug. But it was very similar programming to where they could access your phone with a warrant. They could upload things, download things from your phone. They could delete things from your phone. And we're seeing that similar thing kind of happen in Australia. And my big concern that's always been around that is using that to target activists and get people taken down through planting things or manufacturing things or, just deleting their presence off the internet.
Well, there's another bill being considered by the current government that was proposed by one of the parliamentary committees, and it was a bipartisan one, and both sides said that what needs to happen is the government needs to bring in a system where you've got to present 100 points of ID to use social media, and then the police will have unlimited access to your account.
Yeah, I saw that too, the 100 points of ID. What does the points actually represent in that? Is it like, are they literally asking for 100 pieces of information, or is it like a point system of like your ID is 30, this is like 10 kind of thing?
Yeah. So different IDs worth different points.
Yeah, that's spectacular. And is that mandated federally? Is that a state thing? Like, how are they going about that?
That'll be federal.
Jesus Christ. Okay. Is there any kind of like institutional, because I've obviously seen like a lot of grassroots opposition to this, but is there any institutional opposition to this? Any political parties, major organizations, anything coming out against this strongly, or is it mostly just grassroots individuals?
It is mostly grassroots. There's a couple of law firms who are helping people fight fines for if they've been fined for breach of lockdown. It was when they passed a recent bill, the party registration bills. There were 3 of them, which were aimed at making things harder for minor parties to register. Raising, for example, one of them raised the limit for the threshold from 500 to 1,500 members, paying members you need to be able to register a party federally if you don't already have seats in Parliament. We had 2 people in the lower house vote against that, 2 of 150.
Jesus Christ.
One of those guys, Craig Kelly, is about the only MP to be outspoken about the lockdowns. There are a couple of other ones here and there who protest. In the Victorian State Parliament, there are 3 libertarians. Two of them belong to the Liberal Democrats Party, which is our version of the LP. They were protesting when the government locked down the parks. These 2 MPs in the upper house decided to sit on the steps of Parliament in protest. And of course, they couldn't be arrested by the police because they were doing parliamentary duty, because they were on parliamentary grounds as their MPs or members of Parliament. And the 3rd Libertarian from the Reason Party, Fiona Patten, voted with the Labor government in the upper house to suspend the upper house for 2 weeks during lockdown. And she's voted with the Labor government to support lockdown restrictions. So
very libertarian.
Yeah, it's very libertarian of her. She's our version of the Cato Institute, except if Cato was in government.
Oh, great. Yeah, that would be lovely and spectacular. As someone points out in the chat, this really does seem like a almost social credit system, of the fact of like having unlimited access to your phone. You're not allowed to access the outside world unless you give so much information on yourself. You're not allowed to go outside without like scanning QR codes or checking in through this app and everything. I don't even know how to put it. Do you see any immediate way out of this? Do you see this ending to any degree, or do you see this just getting worse? Because that's a lot of us looking for the outside in are kind of concerned that this is about to slide off the rails. And I don't know if you get a vibe from that in there of whether this is all just going to go sideways soon, and whether that be like mass resistance to it, or the other side of it of the government like cracking down even harder than they already are. Or do you see this kind of coasting and remaining at the level it is for a while?
I am expecting to see more restrictions once we get the vaccination rates up. Once we get 80%, which is meant to be the end of this year, they're going to bring in a vaccine passport. So it's going to get worse.
And how are they handling like the vaccine distribution? Because I know this is every single country almost has a different way of handling this. Some people, they're focusing on the most people at risk. Other people are focusing on like minorities and refugees. Other places it's almost like a wealth class system where the rich people are getting it first. How are they handling the vaccines in Australia?
Horribly. That's the best way to describe it. Our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has absolutely botched the vaccine rollout. I'm even like people who are from the right who oppose the vaccines say he's botched it. he had to literally buy 1 million doses from Poland. That's how bad we've been here for our rollout of the vaccine. It's been very haphazard and very messy. Had to buy from other countries to make sure we have enough vaccines. And it's open to anyone. I think they're considering Pfizer for 12 to 15-year-olds. I don't know if that got approved yet, but they are trying to vaccinate everyone they can.
Okay. And I'm glad you mentioned 12 to 16-year-olds because there was that, I think it was an MP or either the health minister or something like that, gave that statement where apparently they're doing something at a stadium with like thousands of children and the parents are not allowed in with no context. That was fucking horrifying to hear that guy speak. What is that how they've been doing the vaccine rollouts among kids already? Like what exactly is going on with that?
With context, that story is even worse. But yeah, they put students into one of the football stadiums to give them the jab.
And no parents are allowed in, no supervision, nothing like that, and they're just factory.
That was 24,000 students in the space of 1 week, and that process continued after that.
And there no parental supervision, no outside factors, nothing.
I think there's no parent supervision. I'm pretty sure that's the case. And it's because the schools are closed, so they can't give the students the jab at school. So they bring them to the football stadiums instead, and they get the jab there. So that way they're with their friends and that sort of stuff. And it's a way the government can access them easily.
Right. And again, we're leading into so many things I'm curious about. For the background, when it came to the remote schooling thing, there was a whole bunch of shit that happened over in the United States over what was kind of going around that, to where there was instances where parents got fined or had child protective services deployed on them because of something in the background of their kids' cameras. There was instances of people getting like firearms confiscated. There was all sorts of drama around having essentially these state agents spying into people's homes through kids' kind of cameras. Has anything like that happened in Australia at all? Because that happened a lot here, and I'm always curious to ask people about that.
I have not seen stories like that. Of course, the media's not going to report on some of the stories, obviously, because the media tends to support what's happening with the lockdowns and that sort of stuff. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's happening here. Honestly, I would not be surprised.
Yeah, because I think there was the famous instance is some kid, I think it was in Baltimore in the United States, had like toy airsoft guns on the wall behind him in his room because he plays airsoft, and they had child protective services. The school called child protective services on the parent for having airsoft guns in the kid's room. So like wild things like that have been happening. So I'm always curious to ask people in different countries of whether something like that's going on, because I know some countries have even worse of kind of a nanny state concept than Americans do.
So this isn't COVID related, but in South Australia, you've got to register some Nerf guns as firearms.
Oh yeah, I know you guys aren't even allowed to have like plastic BB airsoft. You have to have gel airsoft guns.
Yeah, so gel blasters, I think it's gel blasters, are illegal in South Australia. And you've got guns who function in the same fashion as Nerf guns that work in the same fashion as gel blasters do. So you've got to register those Nerf guns as firearms. That's how strict the firearm laws are here.
God, man. So what's your plan to be evacuated by night from this country? It's I think because a lot of people don't. That's why I always ask about like the small details, because everyone kind of goes over like the big headline catching things, but there's always like small crazy stuff that people overlook of like, in America, for example, having to have a license to have a lemonade stand and 5-year-olds getting arrested for selling lemonade. That doesn't hit the news, but if you talk to someone on the ground, they'll know about that. And that's why, I've been trying to ask you questions of more obscure day-to-day things, because this is the kind of stuff that builds up to like a real tyranny. If you think of, sorry, go for it.
So do you guys know about the truckies protesting?
No, I have not.
I presume because there were videos going around on Twitter of truckies saying, we're going to protest, we're going to, all of us are going to stop and we're going to park on the highways. Some were staying for 2 weeks. Yet 2 hours.
Who were
A
they?
couple of trucks blocked the highway for 2 hours. That was it from the protest from the truckies.
And were they arrested? Were they fined? Like what happened, or did they
They
just
were
give up?
fined.
Yep.
They were fined. But the senator from Queensland, Pauline Hanson, who some Americans may know as the woman who walked into Parliament wearing a burqa to protest people being allowed to wear burqas. But yeah, she went to the protests with these truckies, and then after 2 hours said, "You know what? Let's call it in. Let's go home."
So she pretty much astroturfed that and took it over and kind of called it.
Yeah.
That's why you don't trust politicians, friends. They're always going to cut your activism out by the knees every single time. Yeah, it's so overwhelming, and I know that it seems so hopeless, and there's so many other kind of layers to it that people don't really understand. I know I don't know if you know who he is, but I follow a Australian YouTuber called Shadiversity. He's like a big like military history guy, and he was talking about how much effort he had to go through to fly out to Canada for work, and how much pain in the ass it was to get like an appointment for the vaccine, and then he almost didn't get approved for the vaccine, and then a detail he kind of glossed over, and I don't know if there's any stories about this that you can kind of like substantiate on this, but he was talking about how a bunch of people were going to the airport, and when they would try to fly to Canada or something like that, they would put travel restrictions and claim that it was from the country they were heading to that didn't actually exist. And for example, he was flying to Canada, and they were trying to say that he needed a Canadian passport or a Canadian work visa to fly to Canada. And Canada actually didn't have that restriction at all. But the airline in Australia was trying to tell him that. And then he said the same thing happened to his work partner, and it actually worked, and he wasn't able to leave the country. Is there other kind of things like that where there seems to be some sketchy things preventing freedom of movement and stuff like that?
Oh, definitely. The borders closing down is obviously the biggest example of that. Interstate borders. There's a court case. I forgot its name, for the 1980s, I think, or the 1990s, where the High Court of Australia, which is a version of the US Supreme Court, basically said, interstate borders are a federal jurisdiction, because that's in our constitution, that the states cannot stop interstate commerce and communication. And the High Court of Australia said that includes people being able to move from state to state. But then, of course, Scott Morrison's let the states, control their own borders now and lock those down. International borders are going to be, he said earlier this year that we're not going to see our borders fully reopen internationally until 2024.
Well, 3 years from now. Okay, that's great. And that's totally not just going to nuke your country's economy and just all sorts of things. Someone in the chat said, I just pulled it up here, I don't know if you can read that, but is that something that's going on? If you can't read it, I'll read it out loud.
Yeah, they can. So that's Bruce is one of the guys I work with on Twitter.
Nice.
And yeah, he's we've got a network of about 3 dozen Aussie libertarians on Twitter that I work with, looking at working on podcasts and that sort of stuff just to get the word out there. But yeah, he's correct. So the government said that if you live overseas, it's harder for you to get into Australia, visit your family. For example, if you're from Africa, for example, and you've got family in Australia who works and earns remittances and sends those back overseas, it's hard to come into Australia to visit them, and vice versa now. You don't get automatic, and if you have citizenship in Australia, you don't get automatic entry from overseas.
Wow.
So even citizens can't come back.
Wow. Oh my God. I just feel so bad for y'all over there, and I don't really know what to do. Like for you personally, kind of as like a closing thing, because we are coming up towards time, but I definitely want to cover this. What do you personally think needs to be done right now in the immediacy from people in Australia and from people overseas that we need to do like this moment right now? This podcast ends, and what do you think solution wise means to address this, and how do we kind of overcome this in the long term?
So obviously the big way right now from the rest of the world is to be, sharing whatever you see like sharing it on social media and in person, talk to people, let them know what's actually happening down here, because a lot of what is happening down here isn't being reported overseas. So make sure you know what's happening down here. Make sure you know your stuff about it, and then tell people. I was talking to Clint from Liberty Lockdown, and he was saying what we need to happen is we need to see a murmur around the world of people who are protesting what's happening in Australia, and have people around the world getting word out and what's happening here. And meanwhile, we're working on doing grassroots stuff in Australia to make sure that people in Australia, to win the cultural war, because people in Australia do not have a liberty-minded mindset. I know a lot of Americans will say to Aussies, this wouldn't happen if this wouldn't happen to you guys if you didn't give up your guns. And a few of us Aussies believe that that's more of a symptom than the actual cause itself. So the argument that we make is that if Aussies did give up their guns in 1996, it would be because we have a different mindset, a mindset that isn't submissive to the state. So it's the mindset that's causing this, not the actual fact that we don't have guns.
Yeah, I always say that it's a software problem, not a hardware problem. Because even in America, we are armed to the fucking teeth, and we have allowed a lot of suppressions of liberty and trampling on natural rights, and we've done literally nothing about it, despite being more armed than all the militaries in the world combined. So it is definitely a software issue, not a hardware issue. And I think right now, from the way you describe Australia, we could just airdrop 1 million firearms into the country, and they would just willingly turn them over to the government, like they wouldn't use it. So
I said that on Twitter yesterday. I said the exact same thing. Like, don't send firearms. People will give them up to the state. That's the mindset here. It's because we got our independence from the UK by voting. So we didn't have a revolution like America, and we have not had to fight a war that was life or death for Australia like the UK has. So we don't have any, we take freedoms for granted here. Yeah, so that's why this is happening. Is people, they're fine to lose their freedoms because they haven't had them threatened before. Yep.
Yeah, definitely. Sasha pointing out that it really seems like you guys never stopped being a penal colony, unfortunately.
It does feel like that sometimes. Yeah. Obviously, we have more freedoms now than obviously they did back then, but it is going down a dangerous path.
I mean, I keep saying that we need like 100 Ned Kellys. That's we need the Ned Kelly movement to come back in Australia and be running around.
We need 100 Eurekas.
Right.
So the I presume you know what the Eureka stockade is?
Yes. But you could tell people that are unaware.
So for those that don't know, so in I think it was the 1850s, a bunch of gold miners protested against the government for licensing, and they were being taxed, but they didn't get a say in Parliament. So the exact same thing as the US did with their taxation, with no representation in government, brutalities by the British police and military. So they made a stockade, and they had a shootout with the British police and the British military. And that's what we need. We need people who are more willing to resist. Like, obviously, like, I don't support violent protest, violent resistance, but we need people who are willing to go to that level if need be. Who are willing to do civil disobedience, that sort of stuff. Yeah, because that's the only way we're going to win. We have, like, if we're violent now, like a lot of foreigners say to me, you guys should. They take up arms and fight the state. Well, if we do that, we're not going to win people's hearts and minds over. They're not going to support us if we go violent. If we want to go violent, we've got to win the people first, and then we can go after the state.
Yes,
and that's the stance that I take. It's the only way to win the people over.
Yes, civil disobedience in parallel societies are very important for people watching and for people that don't understand. For 8 years before the American Revolution, you had counter economies, you had people refusing to buy British goods, you had secret elections of their own mayors and governments, you had tax evasion, you had illegal production of weapons and stuff like that. All of that went on for a long time before shooting ever happened. And if it wasn't for some actions that the English took, shooting probably would have never happened, and they would have just starved the English out, and the English would have just fucked off eventually. So it's definitely the little things. Even though I am the boogaloo person, I think a lot of people advocate the aggressive, shootouts with the government and stuff like that. And sure, that has its place. I will never deny that has its place. but there is a lot of groundwork that needs to be done before that. And I'm glad you acknowledge that. And I'm glad that it seems to be that there's some people that are networking and they're working on kind of counter institutions and counter economy and stuff like that, and building up these kind of networks of people, because that's the most important key thing.
Well, yeah, this network computing of Aussie libertarians, we've gone from that to looking at setting a couple of podcasts. One's in the works right now, maybe a website where we can write some articles and get the truth out there. So trying to, really spread what's actually happening and trying to win the people over that way.
Absolutely.
So I just saw someone say non-violent means are better for optics, and that's 100% correct. Like, optics to how the people see you, and if you're going to be violent, you're going to lose their support. MLK won civil rights in America, not the Black Panthers who were armed and walking with guns. Gandhi got independence for the Indians, not the violent revolutionaries.
Yeah, and I mean,
you can have success peacefully. You won't always have success peacefully, but you can. It depends on the mindset of the rulers.
And even to like the Black Panther things, like we remember them now pop culture wise because of the walking around with guns and stuff like that. But they were so embraced and loved by the Black community and even some white communities because they were
all those health programs and stuff, was it?
Yeah,
they
did a bunch for sickle cell research. They did a bunch of like medical assistance for their community. The free lunch program in America was based off the Black Panthers. They essentially brought that into being through their own activism. So even that, like, and the Black Panthers almost have more of a cultural impact and staying power throughout America than the Libertarian Party does. So like, it's actions like that community building, that networking, those parallel societies. That's how you win. That's how you get staying power. And I'm really glad that I talked to you.
That just proves the importance of optics as well. That just proves how important optics are, because the fact that we remember them as being bad because they had guns, even though they did all this great work in the community. You're like, if we were doing the exact same thing, people wouldn't remember us to the work we did to promote liberty. People would remember us for the people who walked around carrying guns.
Right. And that's why I'm glad that like you haven't taken either of the two failure paths, as I'll call it, of people that are just like, we'll just rise up and start shooting cops. It's like, no, like that's not going to go how you think it's going to go. But then the opposite side of just like, oh, vote harder. Like that's also not going to accomplish anything either. Like you have to start taking more innovative and intelligent actions that kind of bring this about. So I'm really glad that it seems what you guys are trying to build over there is with the right mentality and on the right path.
Well, in Australia, you can't vote your way to freedom because we have mandatory voting, which means that all the people who don't care about politics will just vote for the two main parties. So they're going to get into power anyway. So you can't vote your way to freedom in Australia.
I didn't know you guys. See, I didn't know you guys had mandatory voting. That's what I mean. That's another very important detail that a lot of people aren't aware of or don't talk about. That kind of influences what's actually going on.
It goes back to World War I, where the governments of Australia, the state governments and the federal government were saying, people, have stopped voting. We've got lower vote turnouts. I think it was around 50 or something like that. That could be wrong. That's just from memory. So we had low voter turnout rates. So the government didn't want such low rates. So they said, we'll make voting mandatory for everyone, to get the votes up just for a while. It's been 100 years.
Yeah, I would say
done.
There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. So
Queensland was the first state in 1915. And by the mid 1920s, it was every state in the federal government that had mandatory voting. Ironically, the only time we voted voluntarily was in 2017, where we did a same-sex marriage plebiscite because the politicians were too spineless to decide themselves on whether we should have gay marriage or not. So they instead got the people from all around Australia, to do a voluntary vote, which would then help the government to inform them which way to vote. So the only time we've had voluntary voting in the last 100 years was on same-sex marriage as basically a postal survey that was open to the entire country.
What fucking cowards. That's just spectacular to me. Okay, we are coming up on time though, my man. I do want to give you an opportunity. Everyone that's watching, everyone that has watched, follow this man. Keep an eye on what's going on in Australia. First off, is there any content creators or like Australian-based personalities and stuff like that you know of that people should follow that you can reference right now before I have you give all of your kind of plugs and everything?
I would say Sydney Watson, but it's important. Like a lot of people I've spoken to in Australia in the libertarian movement have said that we've got to be careful there because A, Sydney is a conservative, but not a libertarian, and B, she doesn't actually live here and live what we're seeing right now.
Okay, so there really is kind of like nobody then. Oof, that sucks. Okay, and then yeah, outside of that, my man, plug all your stuff if you have what you might name this website you're going to make, just so we can kind of prime it in people's minds, where people can find you on Twitter, if you have any other social medias, and anyone else in your network you think people should follow.
So you can find me at LibertyDownUnder, spelled UNDR on Twitter or UNDER on Instagram. We are tentatively naming this podcast the Gun Tree of Liberty after Jefferson's speech about the Tree of Liberty, and the website might be called Aussie Liberty Movement, also Aussie Liberty Network, but we are still finalizing that. We don't know about the website, how long that's going to take us to set up. We've got one libertarian web designer who's about to start work on it, hopefully, but the podcast should be up within a couple of weeks, hopefully, if everything goes to plan.
Hell yeah, and I'll definitely promote the hell out of that because I think this is something important, because we're seeing a lot of people in the West, a lot of politicians and even normal people look at what's going on in Australia and be like, that's great. We need to do that here. And Australia is part of the Five Eyes network, which is, our global surveillance state. They work heavily with NATO and everything like that. So there's a pipeline here, and we have to keep an eye on it, because what happens over there is it might trickle here. And on top of the fact that we should not be happy that there's a Western country of millions of people that is going through essentially some weird science fiction fucking novel like you guys are experiencing over there.
Yes.
So yeah, definitely keep us all updated on that. If any of that comes out, I'll go back and update the links on this if anyone watches on, so they can click on that, and definitely let me know when you put your podcast out, and I'll blast that out, my man. I appreciate you coming on here.
Thank you.
All right, and then thanks for everybody who's watching. Next week there will be a show, but I'll be in Washington DC, so I'll literally be on my phone, just like bullshitting about the event. So that won't be anything too formal. The week after that is when we'll get back to kind of like regular programming, and hopefully by my webcam that I'm totally not stealing from Amazon will be here by then. So yeah, I appreciate everybody. Thank you once again for coming on, man. And I'll see everybody next week. Stay safe and stay free.